History is full of shocking facts and stories, whether it's things that seem too impossible to be true, or those that challenge our commonly held beliefs. There is no shortage of fascinating stories from throughout history, and today we're going to take a brief look at 50 such facts to surprise you. And if you like this experimental format of video, let us know and we'll make more! Arctic Camels. When you think of camels, the first thing that likely comes to mind is the deserts of Africa and the Middle East. But while in modern times camels are associated with hot and arid climates, this was not always the case. For millions of years, wild camels roamed across North and Central America. Rather than evolving to survive in exceptionally hot climates, the species camelops were a variety of Arctic camels. The camelops would have looked similar to your average dromedary, though it's unclear whether or not they had humps. A camel's hump contains no bone, instead consisting of fat. So the fossil record gives no indication whether these humps existed on the camelops. The other key difference between a camelops and modern camels is that they were larger, with the Arctic camels being 1 to 2 feet taller than the desert camels. These were one of the many species that fell to extinction following the end of the last ice age, with the camelops believed to have died off around 11,000 years ago. Though there have been a few specimens found that appeared to die as the result of human intervention, there's not yet enough evidence to state that humans hunted the animals to extinction. The original computer bug. There's an often told story about the origins of the term bug as it pertains to software. According to the tale, computer scientist and Navy Rear Admiral Grace Hopper was working at the computational laboratory at Harvard University. The team was developing the Harvard Mark II, also known as the Icon Relay Calculator. Grace frequently went on to tell the story that the computer had been malfunctioning, and the source of the malfunction was traced to a moth that had gotten trapped in one of the computer's relays. The moth was removed from the machine and taped into a notebook with the note, "First actual case of bug being found." It sounds like an apocryphal tale, but this story is completely true. However, it wasn't actually the origin of the term. The term bug had been common in engineering since the 1870s, so the engineers were amused when they found that their problem was being caused by a literal bug. That's why the notebook referred to it as the first actual case of a bug being found, as all previous bugs in machines had been metaphoric. But if you've heard a very similar story to this involving a mouse rather than a moth, yes, that is actually where dead mouse got its name. Ancient toothpaste. While it strikes us as a more modern invention, toothpaste has actually existed for thousands of years. The earliest record of a recipe for toothpaste dates back to the year 4 AD, and it included pepper, mint, iris flowers, and crushed rock salt. But while that's the oldest definitive record, it's believed that dental hygiene dates back at least another 5,000 years. Though no evidence of a specific recipe can be found, it's believed that ancient Egyptians used a combination of burnt eggshells, powdered ox hooves, ashes, and pumice as a form of toothpaste, which sounds horrible. Research into these various recipes showed that they would somehow be effective at preventing disease, freshening breath, and whitening teeth. Similar style recipes have been found out of Asia as well, showing that oral hygiene has been important to all of humanity for longer than you probably realized. Of course, while they may have served their intended purpose, we can't actually recommend any of the ancient recipes, as the ingredients involved were often extremely abrasive, guaranteed to make even healthy gums bleed and potentially damage and remove your teeth's enamel. But don't worry, just go to the store and buy some Colgate. Ancient computers. If you've consumed any amount of history or even pseudo-history content, then you've likely heard of the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient mechanical computer from the 2nd century AD that is often used as evidence that extraterrestrials visited Earth thousands of years ago. However, the Antikythera mechanism isn't alone, and there are actually a multitude of ancient mechanical computers from that same time period. The most abundant of these was the astrolabe, a mechanical star chart that served a variety of uses. At the most basic, astrolabes could be used to identify celestial bodies and predict their future locations. However, these were also useful navigation tools, as they would allow a user to determine their latitude based on where in the sky these bodies appeared. Or, if you already knew what line of latitude were on, they could be used to determine the exact time. There were even attachments to these devices that could determine things like the slope of an angle or the elevation of a mountaintop. Although they were extremely useful, they were limited in precision by their size and mechanical nature, as well as their assumption of a geocentric solar system. They were also good for navigation on land or in calm waters, as choppy water would make finding one's position relative to the sky much more difficult. The Great Emu War. In 1932, Australian farmers were facing an invasion that threatened not just their crops, but the lives of all Australians who depended on them to provide food for their nation. That invasion came in the form of wild emus. The government had enacted a bounty program to encourage locals to take care of the emu problem themselves, but it was not enough. The farmers wanted help from the Australian military, and the military decided to oblige. Armed with 10,000 rounds and 2 Lewis guns, a form of light machine gun used in World War I, the military prepared to mow down the emus by the thousands. But the emus had other ideas. According to one ornithologist, quote, "The machine gunner's dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus was soon dissipated. The emu command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split up into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic. A crestfallen field force therefore withdrew from the combat area after about a month." The quote ends. After a month of engagements between the military and the birds, only between 1,000 and 3,000 emus had been slain. It was enough to save what remained of that year's wheat harvest, and there were no human casualties from the war, but farmers kept requesting military intervention in future years as the emu problem had not been solved. But the military declined to ever face off against the emus again. Cleopatra and the moon landing. There are a few names that are synonymous with ancient Egypt. For many, the first and possibly only names that come to mind are Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, Ramesses II, and Nefertiti. Granted, Ramesses II implies the existence of a Ramesses I, but you rarely actually hear anything about that dude. But because there are so few figures from ancient Egyptian history that people are aware of, it can be easy to forget just how long ancient Egypt existed for. Ancient Rome and ancient Greece are considered to have lasted for about 1,000 years each, so it is often overlooked that ancient Egypt lasted about 3 times as long. And that only takes into account the period after Egypt was unified in about 3100 BC, not what all of those people were doing for the thousands of years before that. So, for somebody like Cleopatra, who was born in 69 BC, parts of what we consider to be ancient history would have been ancient history for her as well. Most notable are the Great Pyramids of Giza. These pyramids were already ancient history by the time Cleopatra was born, with her birthday being closer to the moon landing than to the construction of the pyramids by about half a millennium. Ben Franklin's air baths. Benjamin Franklin is one of America's most accomplished founding fathers. He was a polymath, inventor, scientist, statesman, diplomat, printer, publisher, philosopher, and even America's first postmaster general. But he also had an interest in medicine. While germ theory was not a widespread notion at the time, Franklin was of the belief that there was some sort of pathogen transferred from one human to another that caused the spread of disease. This went counter to conventional wisdom of the day, especially when it came to the common cold. Most people believed that the cold was caused by being cold, and they would stay bundled up indoors during cold weather even if the people they were with were sick. Franklin disagreed with this practice and thought it was the true reason that cold spread. He had noticed that cold seemed to be transmitted by healthy people sharing the same air as the sick, and determined that the circulation of air was important. As a result, Franklin would take daily air baths even in winter, where he would open all of the windows in his home to circulate air before taking a seat directly by a window. He would also do this completely naked. While he was certainly onto something about the spread of disease and likely avoided many minor illnesses this way, there wasn't actually any benefit to doing this naked, especially for his neighbors. Counting systems. Now, you're familiar with the Arabic numerals, the digits 0 through 9 that we all use today. There's a good chance that you have at least a passing knowledge of Roman numerals as well. While Roman numerals are a bit unwieldy and don't include the number 0, they are a base 10 number system just like we use today. And since they were using that thousands of years ago in ancient Rome, it's easy to assume that throughout all of human history, we've used base 10 for numbers. But that's not actually the case. The ancient Sumerians and later the ancient Babylonians used a sexagesimal number system, or base 60. Duodecimal or base 12 and sexagesimal were popular in ancient times because 12 and 60 are highly composite numbers. Highly composite numbers are those that have more divisors than any number before them, and there are some practical benefits to using these instead of a decimal number system. These aren't the only different number systems that have been used either. The ancient Mayans used both base 10 and base 20, and the Yuki, a group of Native Americans from California, used base 8. Because the Yuki didn't have a written language or number system, each non-thumb finger was used to represent a specific digit 1 through 8. These may all seem like relics of the past that have been completely abandoned for the decimal system, but the use of sexagesimal in ancient Mesopotamia is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. Dancing Plague of 1518. Dancing manias were a strange phenomenon that occurred throughout Europe in the 14th through 17th centuries. They were events where people would just start dancing for extended periods of time with no discernible reason. But no dancing mania is more famous than the dancing plague of 1518. It began in Strasbourg in modern-day France when a woman known as Frau Trofea began dancing feverishly in the street. This lasted for about a week, at which point others began joining her. Within a month, the plague had claimed 400 victims, all dancing in the streets of Strasbourg with no end in sight. The dancing went on for so long that it caught the attention of authorities. The council outlawed both dancing and music, but it unsurprisingly had no effect on the plague victims. Authorities surrendered control to local physicians, but their only advice was to let those suffering the mania dance themselves free of it. After about 2 months, the plague began to subside, and all those that had been affected were sent to a shrine to pray. There are claims that numerous people died during the dancing plague as a result of things like heat stroke, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support those claims. But regardless of whether or not anybody danced themselves to death, the cause of the plague remains unknown. Democratic pirates. When you think of pirate captains, it likely conjures images from movies and TV of an absolute authority aboard their vessel. The pirate had special quarters, possibly full of gold and treasure, and was essentially the unquestioned despot of their ship. However, the depiction of a pirate captain is far from accurate, especially as it pertains to the golden age of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. In reality, pirate ships were completely democratic, and the captain wasn't even the ultimate authority. Captain was an executive position aboard the ship, but the quartermaster was also an executive position of nearly identical power. The only difference between a captain and a quartermaster was that the captain chose how to respond in times of attack when there was no time for voting or discussion. Having dual elected executives served as a reminder to both that they were only in charge because they had been voted into that position, and that they could just as easily be removed. Captains and quartermasters also did not receive special quarters, extra provisions, or extra shares of any treasure. Everything was shared equally, with a portion of all money taken in going to a fund to support any of their fellow pirates who had become disabled through their piracy, such as those that had lost limbs or their eyesight. The system was so appealing compared to traditional navy life that many sailors who were taken captive willingly joined the pirates. Dracula the Hero. You already know that Vlad III of Wallachia, also known as Vlad Dracula or Vlad the Impaler, was the basis for the fictional character of Dracula. He is known as one of the most cruel and brutal leaders, famous for his impaling of his enemies on spikes and leaving them on display. He impaled over 20,000 men, women, and children, often having them skinned, decapitated, boiled, or worse, somehow. Vlad is even said to have eaten and drank among the thousands of corpses while all of this went on. But because so much emphasis is placed on Vlad's depiction as a tyrant and the vampire mythology that surrounds him, most people don't realize that he was viewed as an incredibly effective leader. More than that, to many Romanians, Vlad the Impaler is a national hero and one of the nation's greatest leaders. Though his brutal acts were considered atrocities even by the standards of the time, to many they were a necessary means to an end. While there's little debate that Vlad was a tyrant, that tyranny is viewed as having been necessary for uniting the nation and helping them be free of Ottoman rule. Ancient pregnancy tests. Women have wanted the ability to test whether or not they are pregnant for thousands of years. Today, we have highly accurate tests that can be taken at home in a few minutes, but this wasn't always the case. Instead, people relied on old wives' tales and superstitions to tell if a woman was pregnant, though most of these were nonsense that could predict pregnancy no better than flipping a coin. However, whether through dumb luck or actual scientific knowledge, people did recognize there was something different about a pregnant woman's urine. According to writings from 1350 BC, a woman should urinate on wheat and barley seeds for a few days to determine if she was pregnant. If the wheat sprouted, it was a girl. If the barley sprouted, it was a boy. And if neither sprouted, she wasn't pregnant. Though this method is useless for identifying the gender of a child, modern studies have shown it to be 70 to 85% effective at predicting whether or not a woman was pregnant. It wasn't perfect, but it was far more effective than what the ancient Greeks cooked up. The ancient Greeks' pregnancy test was to insert an onion into a woman's vagina overnight. If her breath smelled of onions the next morning, then the scent had wafted through her body because she wasn't pregnant. If her breath didn't smell of onions, then there must have been a fetus in her womb blocking the scent's path. The birth of e-commerce. There's some amount of debate over what the first ever online purchase was. To most people, the first online transaction took place in 1994 when Dan Kohn created a website called Netmarket. His first sale was Sting's album 10 Summoner's Tales, which was purchased by one of Dan's friends. The buyer's Visa card information was able to be encrypted and sent to Dan to use for payments, marking the first time ever that a business transaction including payment was made online. However, there is another contender for the first online sale that dates back to 1971. Students at Stanford University were able to commandeer the school's ARPANET computer, which they used to talk to other students from MIT. While they were not able to pay online, these early 70s students were the first ones to initiate a business transaction online. Of course, even if the ability to send digital payments existed back then, they probably weren't going to whip out their credit cards and leave a paper trail, because the first ever online business deal was for a bag of weed. 40 years later, thanks to the creation of Bitcoin, the Silk Road was founded to facilitate all of your illegal e-commerce needs. Investigative journalism's Oddworld record. Elizabeth Cochrane Seaman was an accomplished journalist of the late 1800s, better known by the pen name of Nellie Bly. She got her start in newspapers after responding to an 1885 article in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled, "What Girls Are Good For." The article rather sincerely stated that girls were only for having babies and keeping a house clean, a sentiment that Elizabeth disagreed with. She wrote a response to the paper, and the editor was so impressed with her work that he offered her a job. After her investigative journalism into abhorrent conditions for female factory workers pissed enough people off, she was relegated to writing about fashion and theater. She quit her job at the paper and eventually wound up being hired by Joseph Pulitzer of the prize fame. At her new paper, she did a groundbreaking and pioneering piece of investigative journalism by going undercover as an inmate at a women's insane asylum. But despite her serious journalism focused on the treatment of women, she is best known for her attempt to break the fictional world record set by Phileas Fogg around the world in 80 days. Not only did she succeed, setting a very real world record of 72 days, but she even had time to stop in France to meet with Jules Verne. The Pope that caused the Black Death. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, has been plaguing mankind for thousands of years. To date, the oldest specimen found to have died from this bacteria lived 5,000 years ago. But if the bacteria that caused the plague had already existed for thousands of years, what happened to allow such a widespread outbreak across Europe? According to many scholars, that would be Pope Gregory IX and his war on cats. On June 13, 1233, Pope Gregory issued the Vox in Rama, a papal decree condemning Satanism and witchcraft. Part of this decree was the assertion that cats were linked to both Satan and witches, and they needed to be persecuted just like their human counterparts. Domesticated cats were brought to Europe by ancient traders as a means of pest control for agriculture, and they had been happily living there for about 2,000 years. But with the Catholic Church and others now ordering the deaths of these animals, their numbers were rapidly depleted. It has been argued that this assault on the feline community allowed the rodent population to flourish, enabling the spread of the Black Death in Europe. Gladiatrices. If the aforementioned article, What Girls Are Good For, was written in 1885, it's hard to imagine there being a time in the past when women had a whole lot of rights, but this really did vary greatly by society. In ancient Egypt, men and women were considered equal in society and under the law. Women in ancient Rome were not considered equal as they could not vote or hold political office, but beyond that, they enjoyed most of the same rights and opportunities as men. They could own property, own and run a business, and they could even initiate a divorce without needing to give a reason. And just like enslaved men could be trained and forced to fight as gladiators, so too could enslaved women become gladiatrices. Though we know this happened until the 3rd century AD when it was outlawed, the sight of a gladiatrix was still extremely rare for ancient Romans. Few accounts remain, mostly in private notes of the wealthy elite, but a few depictions of gladiatrix battles exist in Roman art, including one of a fight between the gladiatrices Amazonia and Aquileia, as identified by the inscription beneath the carving. These women would do battle against one another or against wild animals, just like their male counterparts. The Pirate Queen. Speaking of women showing up in unexpected places, one of history's most successful pirates was a woman named Zheng Yi Shao. She was born in 1775 near Xinhui in China as Shi Yang. It's believed that she was either a sex worker or a madam at a floating brothel, though there does not appear to be explicit evidence of this. While it isn't confirmed, it would explain how she met and subsequently married Zheng Yi, a well-known pirate in the South China Sea. The two wed in 1801 when she was 26 years old, and she took the name Zheng Yi Sao, literally wife of Zheng. There was a lot of fighting amongst the pirates in the South China Sea, but Zheng Yi was able to unite the pirates into a confederation, in no small part thanks to his wife's efforts and negotiations. A few years later, Zheng Yi died at sea in rough weather, and Zheng Yi Sao took over as the head of the federation. Within a year, the Pirate Confederation had become much more active and better organized, with Zhen Yisao having an estimated 1,200 ships and 70,000 crew under her command. Why she called it quits is up for debates, but in 1810 she wound up negotiating an incredible surrender deal with China's Qing dynasty. Though the Pirate Confederation was over, they received pardons, many were allowed to keep their ships, and many of them were able to take positions either in the Chinese Navy or the government. Olympic arts. When it comes to the Olympic Games, we generally think of athletes in peak physical condition competing to be the best at their sport or event. However, in 1912 through 1948, the Summer Olympics also included competitions in art. The 5 categories included architecture, literature, music, painting, and sculpture. The only caveat with these competitions was that all the artistic works were supposed to be inspired by sport in some way. This wasn't without precedent either, as the ancient Olympic Games also had included competitions in art as well as in sports. While trumpeting and heralding were the most popular art competitions in the ancient Olympics, appearing 22 and 18 times each respectively, there were also occasional competitions for poetry, comedy, tragedy, flute playing, lyre playing, and more. When arts were removed from the modern Olympics in the 1950s, their rationale was a bit dubious. Olympic competitors were required to be amateurs, but the artists were all considered to be professionals. The amateurs-only rule was abandoned by the Olympic Committee in 1986, but artists haven't found their way back to the Olympic Games yet. In the blue corner, Honest Abe. Abraham Lincoln is known for a lot of things. He was the 16th president of the United States, freer of the slaves, and unknown to most, an accomplished wrestler. At 6 foot 4 inches, Lincoln's stature would be imposing today, let alone in the mid-1800s. The exact extent of his wrestling career isn't certain, as many of his fights weren't exactly organized, sanctioned bouts. That said, when he was 21 years old, Lincoln became the county wrestling champion. He was trained in the style of catch wrestling, back then referred to as catch-a-catch-can. This was much closer to UFC than WWE, and catch wrestlers were the original professional wrestlers. According to legend, Lincoln wrestled at least 300 times over 12 years, and in all of that time, he's believed to have only lost a single match. This alleged loss was at the hands of Hank Thompson, a fellow volunteer during the Black Hawk War of 1832. The two were wrestling to determine which one of their units would get the better campsite. It's believed that Lincoln's legendary reputation as a wrestler helped him win the presidency, and in 1992, he was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And in the red corner, Plato. Speaking of famous historical figures with surprising athletic credentials, Greek philosopher Plato was also a wrestler. In fact, it's believed that his real name was Aristocles, and that Plato was the nickname given to him by his wrestling coach on account of his incredible girth. Girth in this context being broad shoulders. This wasn't just a means to exercise and stay in shape either. Plato was quite good at wrestling, reportedly competing in the Isthmian Games. The Isthmian Games were part of the cycle of Pan-Hellenic Games. Each Olympiad, or period of 4 years, would feature the Olympic Games the first year, the Isthmian Games the second and fourth years, and the Pythian Games on the third year. According to Diarchus of Messana, a student of Aristotle who was in turn a student of Plato, Plato did extremely well as the Isthmian Games and was well known for his wrestling. Unfortunately, he did not elaborate on exactly how Plato placed in the games, and it is unclear whether he was a contemporary of Plato's or if he only heard the story secondhand from Aristotle. Andrew Jackson's irreverent animal. America has a long history of presidential pets dating all the way back to George Washington. Washington had over a dozen pets, mostly dogs and horses, including a pair of hunting dogs named Drunkard and Tipsy. Out of the 46 American presidents, only James Polk, Andrew Johnson, and Donald Trump did not own any pets, though Johnson could be debated as he reportedly treated the mice that appeared at his office as pets, feeding and caring for them. However, of all of the animals to live in the White House, it is only Andrew Jackson's parrot, Poll, that had a reputation for cursing like a sailor. The parrot was originally intended for Jackson's wife, but when she passed away, he became its caretaker. Taking after its owner, Poll became one of the most notoriously foul-mouthed animals to ever live. When Jackson died, Poll was originally in attendance at his funeral. However, according to Reverend William Normat, who presided over the funeral, quote, "Before the sermon and while the crowd was gathering, a wicked parrot that was a household pet got excited and commenced swearing so loud and long as to disturb the people and had to be carried from the house." Ketchup as medicine. Ketchup can be traced back to southern China in at least the 4th century BC. However, for the first 2,000 years, ketchup was very different from the item we recognize today. It was still a form of condiment for seasoning food, but ketchup's primary ingredients were fermented fish and mushrooms. This continued and spread across the world until 1834, when Dr. John Cook Bennett decided to add tomatoes to his ketchup. And he believed, or at least claimed, that the addition of tomatoes changed ketchup from a mere condiment to a medicinal wonder. His ketchup tonic claimed to be be able to cure diarrhea, indigestion, jaundice, and rheumatism. Though his concoction was likely to do more harm than good for those conditions, he had his ketchup sauce turned into tomato pills that could be sold more easily. The success of medicinal ketchup led to numerous copycat companies advertising similar tomato pills. These pills made even more claims, such as the ability to cure scurvy and mend broken bones. Ironically, while tomatoes could cure scurvy, the copycat pills making these claims were usually just laxatives with no trace of tomato in them at all. The myriad of false medical claims that were made by various companies caused the medicinal ketchup industry to collapse after about 20 years, but people still loved the taste of tomato ketchup. It became so popular and ubiquitous that most people today are unaware fish and mushroom-based ketchups ever even existed. Oxford versus the Aztecs. There are a number of ancient civilizations across the globe, some of which are more heavily studied today in Western society. The first ancient civilizations you likely think of are the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians. There are also, of course, the ancient Chinese, the Babylonians, the Persians, Sumerians, and many, many more. But what about over in the Americas? There were the Olmec and the Mayans, of course, but what about the Aztecs and the Incans? Pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas tend to get grouped together in public consciousness, but the Aztecs and Incans weren't actually ancient civilizations. In fact, Oxford University predates both of them. There is no official founding date for Oxford, but teaching on the campus began as early as 1096, and it grew massively over the next century. By contrast, the Aztec civilization is regarded as having officially begun with the founding of Tenochtitlan in Lake Texcoco. This didn't happen until 1325. Similarly, the Incan civilization didn't begin until the early 1200s, over a century after Oxford University had already opened its doors. The death of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was one of the most respected leaders of the ancient world, despite dying at the age of only 32. However, the cause of his death has always remained a bit of a mystery. Alexander fell ill after some intense partying, and after nearly 2 weeks of being bedridden, he was declared dead. During those 2 weeks, he became extremely ill and weak, eventually being unable to speak and barely able to even hold up his own head. Theories surrounding his death range from poison to various illnesses that were prevalent in the region. However, there is another, more recent theory presented by Dr. Catherine Hall in 2018. According to Hall, Alexander may not have been dead at all, he may have been suffering from Guillain-Barré syndrome. This condition leads to muscle paralysis, and a quarter of those with the disease die from respiratory failure as the muscles responsible for breathing become too weak. According to this new theory, Alexander's weak, shallow breath was mistaken by ancient physicians for no breath at all. One of the key pieces of evidence for this are the contemporary reports of Alexander's body post-mortem. The human body has some pretty clear signs of death, and decomposition can begin in as little as 24 hours. But for 6 days following his supposed death, Alexander's body remained completely unchanged. At the time, this was taken as evidence that he was in fact a god, but if Hall is correct, then the lack of decomposition is because he was still alive and aware the entire time. If that's the case, his cause of death would have been the mummification process. The martyrdom of St. Lawrence. Just as polytheistic religions tend to have a god for every purpose you can imagine, so too does the Catholic Church have a myriad of saints for similarly diverse prayers. Among the most interesting saints was St. Lawrence. Born on New Year's Eve 225 AD, Lawrence was appointed to the role of Archdeacon of Rome by Pope Sixtus II, despite being only 22 years old at the time. The two had met previously when they traveled to Rome together from Spain, serving as a reminder that promotions are all about who you know. As Archdeacon, Lawrence was essentially the treasurer of the Catholic Church. He was responsible for looking after the church's wealth as well as distribution of alms to the poor. Now, you might think that this would result in him becoming a patron saint of accountants or charity or something like that, but his sainthood was actually much more tied to his death rather than his life. In 258, Roman Emperor Valerian essentially outlawed Catholicism, demanding that all preachers should be executed and their wealth seized by the Roman government. Valerian executed Sixtus, following which the prefect of Rome ordered Lawrence to turn over all of the church's money and valuables. Instead, he distributed all of the church's things amongst the poor before going before the prefect. He brought with him blind, crippled, and impoverished members of the church, claiming that they were the church's riches. The prefect was not amused, so he executed Lawrence by cooking him over a gridiron. While he was being cooked alive, Lawrence reportedly declared, "I'm well done this side, turn me over." Because of this quip just before his death, St. Lawrence became the patron saint of chefs and comedians. Lovely. Lord Byron found a loophole. Along with being a famous poet and politician, Lord Byron is also famous for his scandals and eccentricities. Among those eccentricities was his love of animals and the incredible menagerie that he maintained. Lord Byron's collection of animals contained, but was not limited to, numerous dogs and horses, a wolf, a fox, a crocodile, a honey badger, some geese, and a goat with a broken leg. However, in 1805, when he travelled to Cambridge to attend Trinity College, he was upset to learn that his beloved dog, Boatswain, would not be allowed to join him. The college's rules strictly forbade keeping dogs as pets, although they did not explicitly ban all pets. Noticing the loophole and wanting to express his utter disdain for the rule, Byron purchased a tamed bear and he brought it with him to college. While Trinity College wasn't thrilled with this development, they had no legal basis to complain as there was no rule against someone having a pet bear. The bear stayed in Byron's room with him and he would frequently take it out for walks on a leash as if it was a dog. In a letter he wrote to friends from his dorm, Byron stated, "I've got a new friend, the finest in the world, a tame bear. When I brought him here, they asked me what I meant to do with him, and my reply was he should sit for a fellowship." Nazi Germany's advanced interrogation tactics. When it comes to the interrogation of prisoners of war, you're likely to think of unspeakable acts of torture. But for Nazi Luftwaffe interrogator Hans Scharf, interrogation was something different entirely. Scharf was opposed to using violence and torture to extract information, possibly because the efficacy of such methods is debated. Instead, he chose to lean heavily into a different tactic, approved by the Luftwaffe for interrogations, making the prisoner feel like the interrogator was the captive's greatest advocate. Prisoners of war were isolated and often malnourished, and they were met with frequent threats from the Luftwaffe. If the prisoner didn't give more information than just their name, rank, and serial number, there would be no choice but to hand them over for questioning to the Gestapo, the feared Nazi secret police. Once the prisoners were thoroughly terrified, that's when Scharf would walk in. He would tell jokes, bring the prisoners beer and homemade food, and invite them to join him and the Luftwaffe pilots for tea. He would then even take them on nature walks without any guards present, so long as they promised not to try and escape. These methods were so effective that following the conclusion of World War II, Scharf was invited to the United States. He was initially brought to testify at the trial of Lieutenant Monty, an Air Force pilot who defected to Nazi Germany. While in America, Scharf was asked to give lectures at the Pentagon about his interrogation techniques. He wound up immigrating to the US, and many of his techniques are still used today. Forks were the tool of the devil. Forks have existed for thousands of years, but early forks, which usually consisted of only 2 prongs rather than the 4 that are common today, were tools used exclusively for cooking and serving food. The personal table fork used for eating isn't believed to have been developed until the 4th century, at least not ones made of metal. The Chinese had been using 2-pronged forks for about 2,000 years at that point, but their forks were made of bone. Use of table forks quickly spread across Asia and the Middle East, but Europeans were far less willing to adopt the seemingly unnecessary utensil. In the 11th century, a scandal erupted at the wedding of the Doge of Venice and a Byzantine princess. The princess had brought with her a fork to dine with, and the utensil was decried as being sacrilegious, unnatural, and a symbol of Eastern decadence. According to one outraged Venetian, quote, "God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. Therefore it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metal forks for them when eating." Though the fork eventually became popular throughout Italy as it made eating pasta a lot easier, it wasn't until the 18th century that the rest of Europe finally embraced the humble fork. Mary had a little lamb. It's one of the most popular nursery rhymes of all time, but few people realize that Mary really did have a little lamb. Mary Sawyer was an 11-year-old girl from Sterling, Massachusetts, about an hour away from Boston. She found a lamb that had been rejected by its mother and convinced her parents to let her raise the lamb on her own. Mary recalled that the lamb was sick and couldn't even swallow at first, but she was able to nurse it back to health. One day, Mary didn't have time to go and tend to the lamb before heading to school, so she called out its name as she was departing to say goodbye. The lamb recognized her voice and gave chase, eventually catching up to Mary and her brother Nat, who said that she could just bring it to school. Mary did, and she tried to hide her pet lamb in a basket at her feet. Once the lamb started bleating, it was discovered, and the teacher made her put it outside. The original version of the nursery rhyme, which only included one stanza, was written by classmate John Ralston, who gave Mary the poem. 14 years later, Sarah Hale added 3 more stanzas to the poem and published it in a book of poems. Capitalizing on her newfound fame, Mary sold a pair of stockings her mother had knitted with the first fleece from the lamb. The money she raised was used to help repair an old church. France's odd tradition. France's most famous form of execution is the guillotine, and public decapitations were quite the spectacle. But there was an odd tradition in France that whenever one of the country's elite was beheaded, commoners in attendance were invited to dip their handkerchiefs into the blood of the deceased as a souvenir. The same tradition was practiced when King Louis XVI was executed. This was always the story of French executions anyway, though it was believed by many to be either an apocryphal tale or an exaggeration. After all, Louis XVI wasn't universally hated, and his undoing was that he was a weak and indecisive king, not a cruel and brutal tyrant. It seemed odd that commoners would relish the sight of his blood. However, DNA testing has shown that this tradition was very much real. There was an ornate gourd that had been passed through a family for generations with the inscription, "On January the 21st, Maximilien Bourdaloue dipped his handkerchief in the blood of Louis XVI after his decapitation." In 2013, the handkerchief and the then 220-year-old bloodstain were tested for DNA, and the blood had in fact belonged to Louis XVI. Jack the baboon worked the rails. James Jumper Wide worked for the Cape Town Port Elizabeth railway service in South Africa as a signalman. He got the nickname Jumper because he enjoyed jumping between the rail cars. This was a stupid idea, and in 1881, James had an accident that resulted in both of his legs being amputated. James wanted to continue working on the railway despite now being bound to a wheelchair, so he decided to get a little help. That came in the form of Jack, a baboon. James trained Jack to push his wheelchair and operate the levers for the railway signals, under supervision of course. An official investigation was launched when somebody reported seeing a baboon operating the signal levers, but the investigation determined that Jack was competent enough to handle the job. He became an official employee of the railway, receiving 20 cents each day and half a bottle of beer each week. In 9 years on the job, Jack never made a mistake, which is more than we can say for James. The Vatican's Sauciest Pope. One of the best-selling books of the 15th century was The Tale of Two Lovers. It was an important piece of literature, as it is one of the earliest examples of an epistolary novel. This is a novel where the story is told primarily through letters and other correspondence between the story's main characters rather than through exposition. The story centered around a married woman named Lucretia and her affair with a man named Euryalus, who was a servant to the Duke of Austria. While the novel has important literary value because of its then unique method of storytelling, it is also basically just porn. In addition to a number of explicit letters exchanged between the two lovers, the book also contains numerous illustrations that went well beyond merely being suggestive. It's possible that the book's author, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, was inspired to write this novel thanks to his deep familiarity with another book famous for containing countless letters and correspondence, the Bible. After writing this novel, and certainly unrelated to the novel's success given its scandalous content, Piccolomini went on to become Pope Pius II. Most of human history is lost to time. Though humans in various forms have existed for at least 2 million years, modern humans have only existed for about 200,000 years. However, recorded history only goes back about 6,000 years. This means that 97% of human history is unrecorded, almost completely lost to time. Researchers have done their best through archaeological findings to piece together the early history of the human race, but the vast majority of the history of our species remains unknown. We may not know exactly what early humans were up to, but they definitely were up to something. The oldest known evidence of artwork was discovered in a cave in South Africa, and it dates back roughly 100,000 years. The discovery wasn't just a few cave paintings. It was more of an art studio featuring mortar and pestles for making and mixing pigments. It was a huge discovery, one that called into question our understanding of the timeline of human development. On the bright side, this lack of information is somewhat of a self-correcting problem. Even if we learn nothing else about prehistoric humans, if our species can survive another 200,000 years, then by that point, only half of human history will be lost to time. Edison accidentally created Hollywood. Beginning in the 1890s, shortly after the invention of the motion picture camera, New York was the capital of American filmmaking. But there was one problem that was plaguing the film industry at the time, and his name was Thomas Edison. Edison had over 1,000 patents to his name, including the kinetoscope, an early movie camera. Edison actually had patents on nearly all of the equipment required to make movies, and his New Jersey company, Motion Picture Patents Company, held a veritable monopoly on the film industry. Edison's company would sue filmmakers to shut down their productions, causing understandable frustration within the industry. Their solution was to travel out west to Los Angeles. The weather was beautiful, there were diverse locations they could use to film different types of movies, and most importantly, it was far away from Edison. His company still tried to engage in lawsuits over patent infringements, but the distance made it more difficult, and the California judges weren't nearly as amenable to Edison's lawsuits, regardless of how legally justified they may have been. There could have been a President Albert Einstein. Now, we're not suggesting that Albert Einstein was merely the President of the United States, since that would be impossible under the Constitution. Einstein was born in Germany and lived there until 1933, when he renounced his citizenship for political reasons and moved to the United States. He went on to become a dual citizen of the US and Switzerland. However, it was Israel that offered Einstein the opportunity to become their second president, despite him not being a citizen. The presidency was mostly a ceremonial position rather than a position of power, but even so, Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, wasn't thrilled to have to deliver the offer to Einstein. To his relief, Einstein wasn't thrilled to receive the offer either. He turned down an official meeting with representatives from the Israeli embassy, writing to them, "I am deeply moved by the offer from our state of Israel, and at once saddened and ashamed that I cannot accept it. All my life, I have dealt with objective matters, hence I lack both the natural aptitude and the experience to properly deal with people and to exercise official functions." The tragedy of Henry Rathbone. If you've ever seen the contemporary depictions of Lincoln's assassination, there's a detail that you might have missed. The pictures show the fatally wounded Lincoln being held by his wife, as well as John Wilkes Booth jumping from the luxury box to the stage. However, despite Lincoln having been shot, Booth is often seen holding a dagger as he leaps from the stage. This is because of the other person in the scene who is so often overlooked, Major Henry Rathbone. Rathbone and his fiancée Clara had been personally invited to come to the theater that night, and following the assassination, the Major sprung into action to apprehend Booth. Booth stabbed Rathbone's arm, allowing him to escape, but Rathbone never recovered from the guilt. His mental health deteriorated until, in a fit of madness, he murdered Clara before stabbing himself 5 times. Rathbone survived his wounds and was charged with murder, but he was declared insane and spent the rest of his life in an asylum. History's shortest war. In 1890, Zanzibar became a British protectorate. Part of the deal was that any future sultans should first receive British approval before ascending to the throne. On August 25, 1896, the pro-British Sultan Hamad bin Thawani died under suspicious circumstances. Sultan Khalid bin Bargash succeeded him that day, but he had not requested British approval before doing so. The preferred British successor was Hamoud bin Muhammad, who was much more amenable to British interests. Because Sultan Khalid had acted without permission, it was deemed an act of war. The British issued an ultimatum for Khalid to vacate the palace by 9 a.m. on August 27th, while their navy closed in on the location. Khalid refused to vacate and rallied his troops to the palace, barricading themselves inside. At 9:02, the British opened fire on the palace, setting it aflame. By 9:46, the war had ended, with Khalid fleeing to the German consulate for asylum. The war lasted less than 45 minutes, with 500 Zanzibari casualties and only 1 British soldier being injured. Sultan Hamoud was installed as the leader of a puppet government controlled by the British, marking the end of Zanzibar as a sovereign state. Senator Incitatus. Roman Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, had a reputation of being a madman and a deviant. But there was one thing he loved above all else, and that was his favorite horse, Incitatus. Incitatus lived in a marble stable, ate from an ivory manger, and was adorned entirely in purple, the color of royalty. The horse even had 18 servants just for himself to wait on his every need. There is even a tale that Caligula planned on making him a senator. While some suggest this is evidence of Caligula's insanity, many scholars agree that the treatment of Incitatus in general, as well as Caligula's desire to name him a senator, was an elaborate way to ridicule the members of the Senate. He was known for his perverse sense of humor, and it is believed that Caligula only made the claim to convey the notion that even a horse could do a better job than the senators did. Unfortunately, we'll never know if Caligula was actually planning to follow through on this joke or not. He was assassinated before he had the chance to give his horse a promotion. Castro's incredible longevity. Assassinations of head of states have been all too common throughout human history, but there have been far more failed attempts than successful ones, and these can sometimes have the exact opposite effect than what's intended. Obviously, the intended effect would be to kill the person and remove them from power, but a failed assassination can make the leader in question far more popular, almost godlike to the populace. Failed attempts also tend to result in a bit of paranoia from the intended target, or at the very least a greater abundance of caution, making future attempts more difficult. But there is no person known to have ever suffered more assassination attempts than Fidel Castro. According to a 2006 statement from Fabian Escalante, Cuba's former chief of counterintelligence, Castro survived 634 attempts on his life. While it wouldn't be unheard of for somebody in a position like that to overstate the number, there's a good chance this number is pretty close to accurate. The CIA is known to have attempted to take down Castro countless times, both through assassination and via political means, and every attempt failed. In Castro's own words, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal." Oliver Sipple. And speaking of assassination attempts, you would likely assume that anybody that was personally responsible for preventing an assassination would be celebrated as a hero, but that was not the case for Oliver Sipple. Sipple was a decorated former US Marine and disabled veteran who was part of a 3,000-person crowd that assembled to see President Gerald Ford outside of a San Francisco hotel. President Ford was only about 40 feet away when the woman next to Sipple, Sarah Jane Moore, pulled out a revolver and opened fire. The first bullet barely missed, and Sipple immediately tackled her to the ground. She got off a second shot, but it ricocheted against the ground and struck a bystander instead of the president thanks to Sipple's fast action. The man who was hit was fine, and at first it seemed that Sipple was a hero. However, while he was not out to his family or co-workers, he was known as a member of San Francisco's gay community. He requested that the papers keep his sexual orientation off the record, but activists, most notably Harvey Milk, decided that the opportunity to showcase a gay hero was too good to pass up, even if Sipple really didn't want to be recognized as such. He wound up being disowned by his family, never received a commendation or invitation to the White House, and turned to alcohol to fight the depression the entire ordeal had caused. Oliver Sipple died alone at the age of 47, and his body remained in his apartment for 10 days before finally being discovered. Religion may predate agriculture. Humans began as nomadic hunter-gatherer societies. It was long believed that the development of agriculture and its creation of permanent settlements gave rise to writing, arts, and religion. While religions may have existed in the form of oral traditions before cities were built, nomads certainly wouldn't have built any places of worship. It didn't make sense for nomadic tribes to build large temples for worship if they were going to be constantly on the move, and yet that may have actually been the case. The 1994 discovery of the Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey called this entire notion of agriculture predating religion into question. The temple was built in roughly 9,500 BC, centuries before agriculture began in the region. To give a frame of reference for exactly how old that is, Cleopatra may have lived closer to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramids, but those pyramids were built closer to the moon landing than they were to Göbekli Tepe's construction. The evolution of society in different regions followed different paths. So this doesn't mean that temples of worship being built before agriculture was developed was the norm across the world. However, it does call into question our assumption about prehistoric events and the order in which they should have logically transpired. Ernest Hemingway's unfortunate air travel. We've all experienced bouts of bad luck. But Ernest Hemingway's luck, while on a sightseeing tour of Uganda with his fourth wife, Mary, bordered on the comical. They were flying aboard a small Cessna when the plane clipped a telegraph wire, causing it to crash into the shores of the Nile. Hemingway, Mary, and the pilot all survived, and they camped out for the night. The next morning, they were spotted by a tourist boat, which carried them back to town. Following the Cessna's crash, a new plane had been sent to carry the three survivors out of Uganda. They boarded the plane and took off to head home, but almost immediately after taking off, the plane crashed and caught fire. That's 2 plane crashes in less than 24 hours that these three had endured. The pilot was able to kick out the window, and he and Mary escaped through it, but Hemingway was too fat to fit through the window. Instead, he had to break open the door to the plane. For reasons unknown, he chose to break the door open with his head. Once again, they all survived, but Hemingway was never the same. It is believed he suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the disorder that American football players get from having too many concussions. Hemingway may not have been a professional athlete, but this was no less his 9th severe concussion in his life. The Thekadava Synod. They say that dead men tell no tales, but that does not mean that they can't be put on the witness stand. Following the death of Pope Formosus, he was succeeded by Pope Boniface VI. However, his time as Pope was cut short, possibly by disease or possibly by intervention from his successor, Pope Stephen VI. And Stephen had a bone to pick with Formosus. 7 months after the former Pope had been interred, Stephen ordered his body to be dug up and brought to the papal court. There, Formosus was put on trial for perjury and for serving as a bishop despite being a layman, among other alleged crimes. He was, unsurprisingly, found guilty, with Pope Stephen nullifying Formosus's reign as pope. He cut 3 fingers off the cadaver that were used to perform blessings, thus negating any acts performed by the prior pope, and the body was then buried in a graveyard for foreigners. Still not satisfied, Formosus was again dug up and thrown into the Tiber River. Unsurprisingly, this public spectacle turned popular opinion against Stephen. He was imprisoned shortly after the previous pope was dumped in the Tiber, and Pope Stephen was strangled to death while behind bars. The results of the Cadaver Synod were nullified, and an official rule was put in place to prevent putting a corpse on trial in the papal court. The Champa tiger. While the average person would stand little to no chance in unarmed combat against an adult tiger, they fortunately don't think of people as food. Tiger attacks are rare unless they feel threatened or are extremely hungry. And the Champa tiger was absolutely starving. Her natural habitat had been destroyed to make room for farmland and to be used as timber, and these sudden changes caused most of the smaller animals to migrate elsewhere. Those that remained quickly found their numbers dwindling thanks to human poaching. All out of options, the Champa tiger had no other source of food than humans. Her attacks began in the village of Rapal in Nepal. The Nepalese army was called in to deal with the man-eating tiger, but they were unable to capture or kill her. However, they did manage to drive her across the Sharda River, so she was India's problem. The tiger's reign of terror continued as it attacked villages across the Kumaran district. Hunting strategies also evolved to evade human capture, with the tiger often traveling 20 miles under the cover of darkness to attack different villages than when she was last seen. It took nearly 10 years before she was finally taken down by British hunter Jim Corbett in 1907, by which time she was already believed to have killed and eaten 436 people. President Tyler's lineage. Take a moment to think about your grandparents and some of the things that they might have lived through. They may have experienced things like the Great Depression and World War II, but for at least one man, the story goes back much further than that. John Tyler was born in 1790, and he assumed office as the 10th President of the United States in 1841. And despite almost certainly being born well over a century before any of your grandparents, President Tyler has a grandson who is still alive today, at least at the time of writing. In 1853, when John Tyler was 63 years old, his son Leon was born. In 1928, when Leon was 75 years old, his last son Harrison was born. And at 95 years old, Harrison Ruffin Tyler is still alive today. He would frequently speak about the family history, though his health took a turn in 2012 and he unfortunately now suffers from dementia. The earliest fax machine. Though some places still use them, these days fax machines are largely viewed as a relic of the past. They're from a time long before high-speed internet and phones with 8-megapixel cameras. But when Xerox began producing the first telephone fax in 1964, it was a game changer in terms of convenience. However, while sending the information through a phone line was new technology, the idea of a fax machine was not. The very first fax machine, then called an electric printing telegraph, was patented by Scottish inventor Alexander Bain in 1843. This was the same year as America's wagon train of 1843, when 1,000 settlers embarked upon the famous Oregon Trail to emigrate to the western US. The world's oldest complaint letter. For as long as there has been commerce, there have been people trying to fleece their customers. One such man was Ir-Nasir in the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. Ir-Nasir's home was discovered by Sir Leonard Woolley while leading a joint expedition for the University of Pennsylvania and the British Museum. Among the items found was a clay tablet written in approximately 1750 BC, making it the oldest known complaint letter ever written. The tablet was sent by a customer named Nanny, and it was written in Akkadian cuneiform. Nanny was outraged not only at Ir-Nasir's attempts to sell him substandard copper, but at the poor treatment Nanny's messenger received and the wasted time of sending messengers back and forth. The complaint further demanded that Ir-Nasir personally come to Nanny rather than sending a messenger, and that Nanny would select the copper ingots of his own choosing, as was his right. While this particular tablet was the oldest and by far the longest complaint found, it was not the only one. Ir-Nasir seemed to have earned a bit of a bad reputation thanks to his attempts to pass off low-quality copper ingots at high prices, and his possessions included multiple complaints from other customers as well. Be sure to get a good night's sleep. There have been countless disasters throughout human history. Many of these were natural disasters that could not have been prevented, like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Some were intentional acts of cruelty perpetrated by humans, but there are also plenty of examples of disasters that, while caused by human activities, were entirely accidental. Of course, accidental doesn't always mean unavoidable. Experts recommend that the average adult should get 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night, though 30% of Americans get less than 6 hours on a nightly basis. For people in demanding high-pressure jobs or who work exceptionally long shifts at a time, that number is even lower. Unfortunately, the lack of sleep and resulting fatigue affects a person's decision-making capabilities, and poor decisions resulting from sleep deprivation have played a crucial role in numerous man-made disasters. Some examples of disasters that are at least partially responsible to people being sleep-deprived include Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, the Challenger explosion, and the Great Heck rail crash. This list isn't even close to being comprehensive, but it highlights just how important it is for people to get an appropriate amount of sleep. Napoleon's unfortunate rabbit hunt. Napoleon was one of the most famous and successful military commanders of all time. He fought over 80 battles and won all but 11 of them. Most of those defeats came later in his career, during and after France's disastrous invasion of Russia. But there was one other time Napoleon was defeated that is much less famous. The year was 1807, and he had just signed the treaties of Tilsit to put an end to the war between France and Imperial Russia. To celebrate the occasion, Napoleon requested a luncheon and a rabbit hunt. His chief of staff, Louis-Alexandre Berthier, was ordered to track down rabbits for the hunt, and Berthier went all out. He was able to wrangle over 3,000 rabbits. However, Berthier, who was not familiar with the behavior of rabbits, simply gathered the animals from local farms. Had he managed to track down wild rabbits, the hunt would have gone as planned. The animals would have been released from their cages, and they would have attempted to flee from the giant humans who would be seen as potential predators. But when the thousands of domesticated rabbits were released from the cages and saw Napoleon and his hunting companions, they didn't see the humans as predators. Humans were providers, so surely they had been released because it was feeding time. At first, the men found it funny when the horde of rabbits began barreling down on them, but the laughter did not last. Within seconds, Napoleon and his men were swarmed by the thousands of rabbits who were trying to climb up their bodies while nibbling on their clothes. Napoleon couldn't properly fire his gun because his body was covered in adorable furballs, so he tried to knock them off with a riding crop. Eventually, Napoleon was able to free himself from the assault, and he quickly retreated to his stagecoach. Ancient history. Even with some of the things that we've discussed today, it can be hard to fully grasp the entirety of recorded history, let alone all of human history. But we'll end today with Princess Enigaldi Nana, curator of the world's earliest known public museum. Enigaldi was the daughter of Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabonidus is known as the world's first serious archaeologist, and he taught his daughter to appreciate ancient artifacts as well. In 1925, Leonard Woolley was excavating part of a palace and temple complex in Ur when he discovered a series of ancient artifacts. But it didn't take long for Woolley to realize that these artifacts had all been created centuries apart, suggesting that they may have been put in some sort of ancient museum. It also helped that there were museum labels accompanying the artifacts, with the labels written in 3 different languages. While Enigaldi's museum itself is ancient history to us, built in around 530 BC, to the Neo-Babylonians, the pieces contained within the museum were also ancient history. Many had been excavated by Nabonidus, some had been passed down by Nebuchadnezzar, and some are believed to have been discovered by Enigaldi herself. The pieces contained within a museum date back over 1500 years to the 2000s BC. It just shows that it's only a matter of time before we too become somebody else's ancient history.